liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the May 2020 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward, and tonight I'm joined by Tina Stagg and Michael Abdullah, and we're all from the Space Association of Australia. Let's get the show started with some Australian space news. The Australian Defence Force and Gold Coast company Gilmore Space Technologies will work together under a new strategic agreement. The hybrid rocket launch provider is developing low-cost, reliable and dedicated rockets to launch small satellites into low Earth orbits. The partnership between the Defence Science and Technology and Gilmore Space will research defence-related technologies including propulsion, materials and avionics technologies to help develop a three-stage hybrid rocket that will launch small payloads and satellites. Defence Industry Minister Melissa Price said the agreement would open the door for Australian space companies to provide space capabilities to Australia's Defence Force and commercial customers. Recent advancements in the capabilities of micro and nano satellites, small satellite constellations, and additive manufacturing present a unique opportunity for defence and Australian industry, Price said. And over to Rocket Lab. A shake-up in the small launch vehicle market is coming, but there's no consensus on how many companies will survive. Rocket Lab CEO Peter Beck says the next 6 months will be the peak of failure for small launch companies and estimated there was only enough demand to support 2 companies. Fred Kennedy, a former Pentagon official who works for small launch vehicle company Astra, agrees a shakeout is coming but says no one knows just how many companies will make it. A recent study by Quilty Analytics estimated there were well over 100 small launch companies. Nearly all of the contenders will fail, though there is room for perhaps 2 winners among the venture space launch field, the study said. Beck, who founded Rocket Lab in 2006, expects his company will be among the dominant players. He said the company was financially strong and trying to get back on schedule after its primary launch site in New Zealand was shut down due to the coronavirus pandemic. And it's over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, space fans. In International Space Station news, NASA will pay Russia more than $90 million for an additional Soyuz seat to the International Space Station. NASA has completed negotiations with Roscosmos to purchase a seat on an October mission to the station, ensuring a continued US presence in the event of problems with commercial crew vehicles. Aside from paying $90.25 million for the seat, NASA will also carry Russian cargo to the station on its resupply spacecraft. NASA officials said early this month they were in final negotiations with Roscosmos for the seat, but they had not yet decided if they should acquire another seat on a Soyuz mission launching in 2021. And a Cygnus cargo spacecraft left the International Space Station last week. The Cygnus, launched in February on the NG-13 cargo mission, will remain in orbit until late this month to perform combustion experiments and deploy small sats. A Japanese cargo spacecraft will launch to the station later this month, ahead of the May 27 Demo 2 commercial crew mission. And looking at NASA's commercial crew program, the astronauts flying on the Demo 2 mission have entered a pre-launch quarantine. NASA said last week that astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley started what the agency calls flight crew health stabilisation, restricting their access to other people to keep the astronauts from getting sick. While such quarantines are common, there are enhanced protections because of the coronavirus pandemic, with the astronauts getting COVID-19 tests twice before launch and screening of anyone who does come into contact with them for fever or other symptoms. Demo 2 astronauts will get a ride to the launch pad in a Tesla. NASA released pictures last week of the Tesla Model X car that Behnken and Hurley will ride in from an operations building at the Kennedy Space Center to Launch Complex 39A. The white Tesla is adorned with both NASA's worm and meatball logos. And a Space Force unit is ready to rescue the astronauts if something goes wrong during the launch. The 45th Operations Group Detachment 3 at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida is responsible for rescuing astronauts on land or at sea if they have to abort the mission. The unit has been around since Apollo, but its deployment for the upcoming SpaceX Demo 2 mission will be the first for NASA since the end of the shuttle program in 2011. The unit is part of the US Space Force's 45th Space Wing, but when it deploys for a mission, it reports directly to US Space Command. And to NASA's lunar program, NASA now expects the first launch of the Space Launch System to take place in late 2021. In a presentation at a NASA Advisory Council committee meeting last week, the agency said a formal estimate of the Artemis 1 launch date would be announced this week, but the agency now expected it to be towards the end of next year. One reason for the latest slip is the coronavirus pandemic that closed the Stennis Space Centre, where the SLS core stage is being prepared for a static fire test. That green run test is now expected to take place in the northern autumn, potentially as late as Thanksgiving, November 26, as the centre gradually starts to reopen. The agency is refining elements of its Artemis architecture for getting humans to the moon by 2024 to reduce both cost and risk. In presentations last week to the Advisory Council Committee, agency officials confirmed plans to combine the first two elements of the Lunar Gateway, launching them on a single rocket rather than individually and then docking them in lunar orbit. They said doing so could save significant amounts of money and simplify the design of the two modules. The Gateway won't be used for the first lunar landing mission, Artemis 3, but NASA reiterated it will be vital to later sustained missions. NASA is also considering adding a rendezvous and proximity operations demonstration on Artemis 2, the first crewed Orion flight, to reduce risks for the dockings needed for Artemis 3 and later missions. But members of the Advisory Committee are sceptical NASA can achieve its 2024 lunar landing goal. In discussions at the end of the two-day meeting, one committee member called the goal a pipe dream, while others said they doubted NASA could make the 2024 deadline given the current schedule. NASA officials said earlier in the meeting that it was absolutely possible to make that date, citing the lack of new technology development and a push to set requirements early to avoid costly changes later.
Thank you, Tina, and let's turn to US Space Force news. The US Space Force has awarded a contract to SpaceX to gain insights on its launch operations. The $8.9 million fleet surveillance contract from the Space and Missile Systems Centre, or SMC, will give the service engineering information about non-military launches of SpaceX vehicles until November. The contract gives SMC visibility into the company's operations during an especially active launch period as SpaceX deploys its Starlink broadband internet constellation with its fleet of Falcon 9 rockets. The $8.9 million is an addition to an existing $297 million contract awarded to SpaceX in February of last year for 3 national security launches. And the US Space Force received its official flag last week. The flag was unveiled at a White House event where President Donald Trump signed a proclamation for Armed Forces Day. The flag uses the Space Force's official seal, released earlier this year, and places it on a black background fringed in platinum. And turning to Russia. Russia confirmed last week that a rocket stage from an earlier launch broke up in orbit.
Roscosmos said tanks from a frigate upper stage, launched in 2011, broke up earlier this month. The US military's 18th Space Control Squadron, responsible for space situational awareness activities, said it was tracking 65 objects from a breakup of that object, and that there was no evidence that the breakup was caused by a collision. The stage, in an elliptical orbit, was part of a Zenit 3 rocket used to launch the Spectre-R radio astronomy satellite. And turning to China, a giant Chinese rocket stage re-entered over the Atlantic Ocean last week. The Long March 5B core stage re-entered off the coast of West Africa. The stage was left in a low orbit after its launch earlier last week and was the largest object to make an uncontrolled re-entry since the Salyut 7 space station in 1991. Local reports said debris from the stage appeared to have survived re-entry and landed in the African nation of the Ivory Coast, along the vehicle's trajectory, but more than 2,000 kilometres downrange from the re-entry point. It's not known if future Long March 5B launches will leave core stages in low orbits for uncontrolled re-entries, or if this was a one-time event linked to the first launch of the heavy lift rocket. And turning to the United Arab Emirates, the UAE will select 2 new astronauts early next year. The country's space agency received more than 4,300 applications for its second astronaut selection round and will go through a screening process to narrow that down to a small number of finalists before selecting 2 in January. The new astronauts will join the UAE's 2 current astronauts, one of whom, Hazar al-Mansouri, flew to the ISS last year. The UAE is in discussions with ISS partners about new flight opportunities. And turning to Myanmar. Myanmar will join the Club of Spacefaring Countries next year. Engineers in the country are working with Japanese universities on a 50-kilogram smallsat, the first built in the country to be used for monitoring natural disasters and pollution. The $16 million effort is being financed by the government of Myanmar and will include a second satellite. And turning to commercial space news and Virgin Galactic. Richard Branson's Virgin Group is selling part of its majority stake in Virgin Galactic to raise money for its other companies. Virgin Galactic filed paperwork for a Virgin Group holding company to sell up to 22% of its shares in Virgin Galactic, which would raise nearly $500 million at current stock prices. The proceeds will support other Virgin Group companies, especially those in the travel and tourism market that have been hard hit by the coronavirus pandemic. And over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Michael. And looking at some more commercial news, Planet announced last week it will launch 6 more SkySat satellites this year as secondary payloads on 2 SpaceX Starlink launches. Planet said 3 satellites would fly on a Falcon 9 Starlink mission in June, with 3 more on another Starlink launch later this summer. While the previous SkySat satellites flew in sun-synchronous orbits, these 6 will go into mid-inclination orbits that Planet says will offer targeted coverage and rapid revisit times for their high-resolution imagery. And some more commercial news, LEO Labs is now offering satellite operators an automated collision warning service. The LEO Labs collision avoidance will identify potential close approaches and, when necessary, perform additional observations using its network of ground-based radars to refine the prediction, giving the operator more confidence about whether or not it should move its satellite. LEO Labs collision avoidance also promises to evaluate the merit of various manoeuvres within seconds. And back over to Kennedy Space Center in the US, a giant version of the NASA logo is getting a touch-up ahead of this month's SpaceX commercial crew launch. Workers at the Kennedy Space Center are applying a fresh coat of paint to the meatball logo on the side of the Vehicle Assembly Building, which was added to the building in 1998. The logo is 34 by 40 metres across and was last repainted in 2007. And finally this week, a new study concludes that while salty liquid water could exist on the surface of Mars, it would be too cold to support life. The study found that liquid water mixed with salts to form brines could exist for hours at a time and could explain some of the features seen on the surface. However, the brines would be no warmer than minus 48 degrees Celsius, 25 degrees colder than any conditions on Earth where life exists. Researchers said the findings could erase some planetary protection concerns for future exploration of Mars. And that's it for this week. Thank you. We'll speak to you again next week. Thanks, Tina and Michael. Bye now.